Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story is of Sigmund Freud, a seeker of shadows, who dared to map the hidden continents of the mind. Relax as we explore the life and work of Sigmund Freud, a physician turned archaeologist of consciousness, who descended into the depths where desires whisper and memory hides, who explore the mind, discovering the vast unconscious territories beneath awareness, uncovering the hidden theater where childhood dramas replay endlessly, and mapping the strange geography where dreams speak in riddles and the forgotten past shapes every present moment. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychology and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the landscape of the soul. Tell me in the comments what draws you most: the mystery of dreams, the spark of emotion, the intangibility of spirit, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the life and work of Sigmund Freud as we wander the corridors of the unconscious and listen to the whispering mind beneath the mind. In the spring of 1856, in a small Moravian town called Freiburg, a child entered the world who would later claim that childhood itself was the crucible of all human suffering and longing. The town sat nestled in what is now the Czech Republic, a place of modest homes and quiet streets, where the rhythms of Jewish and Christian life moved side by side through the seasons. The child was named Sigismund Shlomo Freud, though he would later shorten his name to Sigmund, perhaps sensing even then that identity is something we revise, that we are always translating ourselves into new languages. His father, Jacob Freud, was a wool merchant, a man already in his 40s when Sigmund was born, a patriarch with a weathered face and eyes that had seen hardship. Jacob had been married before and had 2 adult sons from that first marriage, making young Sigmund's family structure complex from the beginning. The boy grew up alongside nephews who were his own age, blurring the lines of generation, creating a household where the usual hierarchies felt scrambled. Perhaps this early confusion of roles, this uncertainty about where one stood in the family constellation, planted seeds that would later bloom into theories about family drama, about the triangulations of desire, about how a child navigates the forest of adult relationships. His mother, Amalia Nathanson, was Jacob's 3rd wife, and she was 20 years younger than her husband, still in her 20s when Sigmund was born. She was her son's first love, and he was her golden child, her firstborn, the one in whom she invested all her hopes. The intensity of that bond, the feeling of being special and chosen, would echo through everything Freud later wrote about mothers and sons, about the paradise we lose when we realize we cannot possess the one who first held us. When Sigmund was 3 years old, the family's fortunes shifted. Jacob's wool business struggled, and the broader currents of history pressed against him. Anti-Semitism was rising in the region, and the economic ground beneath Jewish merchants was turning unstable. The Freuds decided to leave Freiburg, and after a brief sojourn in Leipzig, they settled in Vienna, the great imperial capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Vienna would become Freud's home for nearly 80 years. The city whose boulevards and coffeehouses formed the backdrop of his inner explorations, though he would always retain something of an outsider's perspective. The consciousness of being a Jew in a Christian empire, a provincial boy in a cosmopolitan city. The Vienna of Freud's youth was a city of magnificent contradictions. On the surface, it glittered with opera houses and palaces, with the music of Mozart and Beethoven still hanging in the air like perfume. The Ringstrasse was being built, that grand boulevard encircling the old city, lined with theaters and museums celebrating the glory of Austrian culture. But beneath the splendor, the city teemed with anxieties. The empire was vast but creaking, holding together dozens of ethnic groups and languages through sheer imperial will. Modernity was arriving with its railways and telegraphs, but the old certainties of religion and tradition were fraying. Sexuality was everywhere repressed and everywhere present, hidden behind heavy curtains and strict proprieties, yet pulsing through the city's veins like a suppressed fever. The Freud family lived in the Leopoldstadt district, a neighborhood with a significant Jewish population, in modest circumstances that sometimes tipped toward poverty. They moved frequently, always seeking cheaper rent, and the young Sigmund shared small rooms with his growing number of siblings. 7 more children would join the family, and space was always scarce. Yet, from the beginning, Sigmund was given certain privileges. His intelligence was recognized early, and the family sacrificed to support his education. He had his own room for studying, lit by an oil lamp, while his siblings huddled elsewhere. When his sister wanted to practice the piano, the instrument was removed from the apartment because Sigmund said it disturbed his concentration. He was being groomed, whether consciously or not, to be the family's hope, the one who would rise, who would justify all the upheaval and struggle. He attended the Leopoldstadt Communal Gymnasium, a rigorous secondary school where Latin, Greek, and German literature formed the core of education. Freud excelled, consistently ranking first in his class. He read voraciously, not just the assigned texts, but everything he could find. Homer, Virgil, Shakespeare, Goethe, Schiller. He absorbed them all, developing a love of literature that would later infuse his case studies with narrative power. He learned English, French, Italian, and Spanish, in addition to his German, and he could read Hebrew and some Arabic. Language fascinated him. The way words could reveal and conceal simultaneously. The way a slip of the tongue could betray what the speaker meant to hide. There was a defining moment in his adolescence, a story Freud himself would later recount, that revealed something about his relationship with his father and with authority. Jacob told his son about an incident from his own youth, how he had been walking down the street wearing a new fur cap when a Christian man knocked it into the mud and shouted an anti-Semitic slur. Young Sigmund asked his father what he had done in response. Jacob said he simply stepped into the street and picked up his cap. To the boy, this seemed like cowardice, like a failure to stand up to aggression. He felt ashamed of his father in that moment, and somewhere in that shame, perhaps, was born the seed of his later theories about rebellion against the father, about the need to overthrow paternal authority to become oneself. But there was also a counter-image that Freud held in his mind, a fantasy figure of heroic rebellion. He identified with the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who had waged war against Rome, crossing the Alps with elephants, refusing to submit to the imperial power. Hannibal was a Semitic hero who challenged the great European civilization, and Freud saw in him a model of defiance. That Hannibal never actually conquered Rome, that he ultimately failed and died in exile, added a note of tragedy to the identification, a sense that the hero who challenges the father empire may be destined for defeat, yet must fight anyway. When it came time to choose a career, Freud initially felt no particular calling to medicine. He was drawn to broader questions, to philosophy and the human condition, to understanding the forces that shaped society and consciousness. But the options for a Jewish intellectual in Vienna were limited. The academic positions in philosophy and the humanities were effectively closed to Jews, no matter how brilliant. Medicine, however, offered a path, a profession that combined scientific prestige with practical skill. And so, in 1873, at the age of 17, Freud enrolled in the medical faculty at the University of Vienna. His medical studies stretched over 8 years, longer than usual, because he kept getting distracted by subjects that interested him more than clinical practice. He spent time in the Institute of Physiology, working under Ernst Brücke, a pioneering physiologist who believed that all psychological phenomena could ultimately be reduced to physical forces, to the mechanics of nerves and tissues. Brücke was one of those stern, rigorous scientists of the 19th century who wanted to purge all mysticism from biology, to show that living organisms were just complex machines obeying the laws of physics and chemistry. Under Brücke's supervision, Freud conducted research on the nervous system of fish and crayfish, painstakingly dissecting and drawing nerve cells, trying to understand the fundamental units of neural organization. He published several papers on the structure of nerve cells, solid, if unremarkable contributions to the growing field of neurology. He was training himself in the discipline of close observation, of patient attention to detail, of not being satisfied with surface explanations, but always looking deeper to the underlying structures. But Freud was also aware that pure research, however intellectually satisfying, would not provide him with a living. He had fallen in love with a young woman named Martha Bernays, and he wanted to marry her, which meant he needed to establish himself in a profession that could support a family. Martha was from a respectable Jewish family, cultured and proper, and their courtship was conventional on the surface, but intense beneath it. Freud's letters to Martha during their 4-year engagement reveal a man of passionate intensity and possessive jealousy, someone who needed to feel that she belonged entirely to him, who couldn't tolerate her having close friendships with others, who wanted to be the center of her world just as his mother had made him the center of hers. To build a practice, Freud needed clinical experience, and so he worked at the Vienna General Hospital, rotating through various departments. He spent time in surgery, in internal medicine, in psychiatry. The psychiatric ward particularly interested him, though the treatments available were almost non-existent. Patients with what were then called nervous diseases languished in wards, sometimes restrained, sometimes sedated with opiates, but rarely understood. Psychiatry in the 1880s was largely custodial, a matter of diagnosis and classification and warehousing, not of cure. It was during this period that Freud became fascinated with cocaine. He had read about this new substance from South America, which was being investigated for its potential medical applications. Freud obtained some and experimented on himself, finding that it produced feelings of exhilaration and mental clarity, that it seemed to lift depression and fatigue. He wrote enthusiastically about cocaine in several papers, suggesting it could be useful for treating morphine addiction, depression, and various other ailments. He gave it to Martha, to his friends, to his colleagues, convinced he had discovered a wonder drug. For a brief time, Freud thought cocaine might be his ticket to fame, the discovery that would establish his reputation. But the story took a darker turn. He recommended cocaine to a friend, Ernst Fleischl von Marxau, who suffered from chronic pain and morphine addiction. Fleischl became severely addicted to cocaine his health deteriorating, and he eventually died in a state of terrible suffering. Meanwhile, other physicians were recognizing the addictive properties of cocaine, and the wonder drug began to look like a dangerous substance. Freud's enthusiastic endorsement became an embarrassment, and he quietly backed away from the subject, though he continued to use cocaine himself in small amounts for several more years. The episode taught him something about the power of desire to cloud judgment, about how we can deceive ourselves when we want something to be true. In 1885, Freud received a traveling grant to study abroad, and he chose to go to Paris to work with Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Charcot was the most famous neurologist in Europe, a showman as much as a scientist, who held dramatic public demonstrations of hysteria. Hysteria was a diagnosis applied mostly to women, a condition that produced an astonishing array of symptoms without any apparent physical cause: paralysis, seizures, tics, blindness, muteness, convulsions. The medical establishment generally viewed hysteria with suspicion, seeing it as malingering or moral weakness, the product of a wandering womb or female frailty. But Charcot took hysteria seriously as a genuine neurological disorder. At his lectures, which drew huge crowds, including artists and journalists, he would present patients on stage, inducing and removing hysterical symptoms through hypnosis. A woman who had been unable to walk would suddenly rise from her chair under hypnosis. A paralyzed arm would move. Charcot demonstrated that hysterical symptoms, though they had no organic basis, were not under conscious control, that they followed patterns dictated by the patient's ideas about illness rather than the actual anatomy of the nervous system. A hysterical paralysis might affect the entire arm in a way that made no neurological sense, because the patient's unconscious mind didn't know how nerves were actually distributed. For Freud, watching Charcot was transformative. Here was evidence that the mind could act on the body in powerful ways, that symptoms could be produced and removed by psychological means, that there was a whole realm of mental activity that operated outside of conscious awareness. If an idea could paralyze a limb, then ideas had a kind of power that traditional neurology didn't account for. The nervous system, Freud began to suspect, was not just a network of reflexes and physical connections, but a medium through which psychological forces operated. When Freud returned to Vienna in 1886, newly married to Martha, he set up a private practice specializing in nervous diseases. His waiting room was often empty in the early years. He tried the conventional treatments of the time: electrotherapy, massage, hydrotherapy, rest cures, but found them largely ineffective. He continued to think about what he had learned in Paris, about the strange power of ideas to manifest in the body. It was around this time that Freud began a fateful collaboration with Joseph Breuer, an older Viennese physician who was well established and respected. Breuer had treated a young woman several years earlier, in 1880-82, a patient he called Anna O., whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim. Anna O. had developed severe hysterical symptoms while caring for her dying father. She suffered from paralysis of her limbs, disturbances of sight and speech, a nervous cough, an aversion to drinking water despite being desperately thirsty, and a tendency to enter trance-like states in which she seemed to be living through scenes from the past. Breuer had visited Anna O. daily during her illness, and he discovered something remarkable. When she was in her trance states, if he could get her to talk about the first time a particular symptom had appeared describing the scene in detail and expressing the emotions connected to it. The symptom would sometimes disappear, at least temporarily. She called this process chimney sweeping, or the talking cure. It was as if the symptoms were held in place by unspoken memories, by emotional experiences that had been trapped inside, and that speaking them released their grip. Breuer told Freud about the Anna O case in detail, and Freud was fascinated. Here was a method, a psychological technique that seemed to work, that addressed symptoms at their mental source rather than just treating the body. Together, Freud and Breuer began treating other patients with nervous disorders using this talking approach, and they started to develop a theory. They proposed that hysterical symptoms arose from traumatic experiences that the patient had forgotten or repressed. The emotion associated with the trauma was somehow dammed up, prevented from normal expression, and it converted into physical symptoms. If the patient could recover the memory and release the pent-up emotion, the symptom would disappear. They called this process abreaction, the discharge of strangulated affect. In 1895, Freud and Breuer published their findings in Studies on Hysteria, a book that is often considered the founding text of psychoanalysis. Though the term itself hadn't been coined yet, the book contained several case studies written in a style that read more like short stories than medical reports, with rich psychological detail and narrative drama. The patients were women who suffered in ways that defied easy explanation, and the cases revealed the tangled connections between memory, emotion, and symptom. But even as the book was being published, the collaboration between Freud and Breuer was unraveling. Breuer was a cautious man, uncomfortable with some of the directions Freud wanted to pursue. Freud had become convinced that at the root of most neuroses was some kind of sexual trauma or conflict. Breuer thought this was too sweeping, too reductionistic, and he was disturbed by the erotic undercurrents that sometimes emerged in treatment. The Anna O case, Breuer later admitted to Freud, had ended in a crisis. Anna had developed an intense attachment to Breuer, and one night she experienced a hysterical childbirth, claiming to be bearing Breuer's baby. Breuer, shocked and frightened, had fled the case, and the next day he took his wife on a second honeymoon to Venice, as if to reassert the boundaries of his proper married life. Freud saw in Breuer's retreat a failure of nerve, but also a clue. The intense emotional attachment that patients develop toward their doctors, this transferring of feelings from past relationships onto the person of the analyst, was not just an awkward complication to be avoided. It was, Freud would come to believe, the very heart of the therapeutic process, the stage on which the patient's deepest conflicts would be replayed and potentially resolved. After the break with Breuer, Freud continued alone, refining his technique and deepening his theory. He was entering what would later be called his heroic period, the years of intense self-exploration and theoretical innovation in the late 1890s. He began the practice of analyzing his own dreams, writing them down each morning and free associating to their elements, following the chains of connection to see where they led. He delved into his childhood memories, trying to uncover the roots of his own neurotic symptoms, his anxiety attacks, his fear of travel, his ambivalence about success. This self-analysis was prompted in part by the death of his father in October of 1896. Jacob Freud died at the age of 81, and Sigmund was devastated in a way that surprised him. He wrote to his friend Wilhelm Fliess that he felt uprooted, that the death of one's father was the most significant loss a man could experience. But he also sensed that the intense grief was mixed with other feelings he had trouble acknowledging. Relief, perhaps. A sense of liberation. And underneath that, old conflicts and resentments that he had never fully confronted. In analyzing his dreams and memories during this period, Freud made a discovery that shocked him. He found that he himself harbored, or had harbored, as a child, feelings of rivalry toward his father and erotic feelings toward his mother. He didn't remember these feelings consciously, but they seemed to be lurking in the symbolic language of his dreams, in slips of speech, in the emotional intensity of his reactions. And as he applied this insight to his patient's material, he began to see similar patterns everywhere. His patients, especially his female patients, initially reported memories of sexual seduction in childhood, usually by a father or uncle. Freud at first believed these were real memories of actual abuse, but then he reconsidered. The sheer frequency of these reports seemed implausible. Could so many fathers really be seducing their daughters? Or was something else going on? In a fateful move that would be controversial for the next century, Freud proposed that many of these memories were not of real events, but of childhood fantasies. Children, he suggested, had sexual feelings and desires from an early age, and they directed these feelings toward their parents. The memories of seduction that emerged in analysis were often scream memories, symbolic representations of the child's own wishes rather than actual historical events. This shift from an emphasis on actual trauma to an emphasis on fantasy and wish was momentous. It meant that the origin of neurosis was not just in what happened to you, but in the turbulent inner world of childhood desire and fear, in the universal dramas of family life that every child navigated. It also meant that the mind was constantly creating fictions, that memory was unreliable, shaped by desire and defense, and that the truth of the psyche was not found in factual history, but in the meaningful patterns of feeling and imagination. Out of this cauldron of self-exploration and clinical work, Freud produced his first masterpiece, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in November of 1899, but dated 1900, as if to mark the dawn of a new century. The book was many things at once: a psychological treatise, a self-analysis, a work of literature, and a manifesto for a new science of the mind. In it, Freud proposed that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, the place where the hidden wishes and fears of the psyche could be glimpsed in disguised form. The central claim was radical. Every dream is the fulfillment of a wish. On the surface, this seemed absurd. What about nightmares, anxiety dreams, dreams of loss and humiliation? How could these be wish fulfillments? Freud's answer was that the wish being fulfilled in a dream was often unconscious and had been transformed by the dream work to make it acceptable to consciousness. The dream we remember, the manifest content, is a compromise formation, a disguised and distorted version of the latent, dream thoughts that lie beneath. The dream work uses several techniques to perform this disguise. Condensation, where multiple ideas are compressed into a single image. Displacement, where emotional intensity is shifted from its real object to something innocuous. And secondary revision, where the mind tries to make the dream into something that resembles a coherent story. Freud filled the interpretation of dreams with examples from his own dreams and those of his patients, analyzing them in meticulous detail. There was the dream of Irma's injection, one of Freud's own. in which he examined a patient named Irma and felt anxious about her treatment. Through free association, Freud traced the dream back to his own guilty feelings about a patient he had treated inadequately, his competitive feelings toward other doctors, and his wish to be absolved of responsibility. The dream, he showed, was doing the work of wish fulfillment by constructing a scenario in which Irma's illness was not his fault, but the fault of a colleague who had given her a contaminated injection. The book sold poorly at first. Only a few hundred copies moved in the first years, and reviews were mixed or dismissive. But Freud was convinced he had made a fundamental discovery, that he had cracked the code of dreams and, in doing so, had found a method for accessing the unconscious mind. The Interpretation of Dreams was not just a book about dreams. It was the unveiling of a new model of the psyche, one in which consciousness was just the surface, and beneath it lay vast territories of forbidden wishes, repressed memories, and archaic impulses. In the years that followed the publication of the Interpretation of Dreams, Freud elaborated his theories in a series of books and papers that tumbled out in rapid succession. In 1901, he published The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, in which he argued that slips of the tongue, forgetting, losing things, and other minor errors were not random, but meaningful, caused by unconscious wishes and conflicts. A man who forgets his wife's birthday might be expressing unconscious hostility. A woman who loses her wedding ring might be revealing ambivalence about her marriage. These parapraxes, as Freud called them, or Freudian slips as they became popularly known, showed that the unconscious was constantly at work, breaking through into everyday life in small but significant ways. In 1905 came 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, a book that scandalized polite society with its claims about infantile sexuality. Freud proposed that sexual feelings did not suddenly emerge at puberty, but were present from birth, taking different forms as the child developed. He outlined a series of psychosexual stages: the oral stage, in which pleasure is focused on the mouth and feeding; the anal stage, centered on control and elimination; the phallic stage, when the child becomes aware of genital difference and experiences the Oedipus; complex, a period of latency; and finally, the genital stage of mature sexuality. Each stage involved characteristic conflicts and pleasures, and failure to successfully navigate a stage could result in fixation, leaving the adult personality marked by the concerns of that period. The Oedipus complex, named after the Greek hero who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother, was Freud's term for the universal drama of early childhood. Around the age of 3 to 5, Freud proposed, every child experiences intense feelings of love for the parent of the opposite sex and rivalry with the parent of the same sex. The little boy desires his mother and sees his father as a rival, and he fears that his father will punish him for these desires by castrating him. This castration anxiety eventually forces the boy to repress his desires and identify with the father, internalizing paternal authority and forming what Freud would later call the superego, the conscience. For girls, a process was more complicated and, in Freud's account, less successfully resolved. The girl notices that she lacks a penis, which Freud thought she experiences as a narcissistic wound, a sense of being castrated. She blames her mother for this lack and turns her love toward her father, hoping to receive from him a baby as a substitute for the missing penis. This penis envy, as Freud termed it, shapes the girl's psychology, leaving her with a weaker superego and a perpetual sense of inferiority. These ideas about female sexuality and development would later be heavily criticized as patriarchal and biologically reductionist, reflecting the gender assumptions of Freud's era more than any universal truth. But for Freud, the Oedipus complex was the nuclear complex of all neuroses, the foundational conflict around which personality organized itself. The way the child navigated the Oedipal drama, the way desire and fear were managed and repressed, determined the shape of the adult character and the types of neurotic symptoms that might later emerge. As Freud's reputation grew, students and followers began to gather around him. A Wednesday evening discussion group started in 1902, meeting in the waiting room of Freud's apartment at Burgos 19. Physicians and intellectuals would arrive in the evening, smoke cigars, and discuss cases and theoretical questions under Freud's leadership. This group eventually formalized into the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, and later into an international movement with affiliated societies in other cities. Among the early members was Alfred Adler, a physician interested in social medicine and the psychology of compensation for feelings of inferiority. Also joining was Wilhelm Steckel, a Viennese doctor who contributed ideas about symbolism and dream interpretation. And then, in 1907, a letter arrived from Zurich, from a young psychiatrist at the Berholzli Hospital named Carl Gustav Jung. Jung had been experimenting with word association tests that seemed to confirm Freud's ideas about complexes and repression, and he was excited to make contact with the Viennese master. The friendship between Freud and Jung began with great warmth and intensity. Freud saw in Jung his potential heir, a brilliant and ambitious thinker who was not Jewish, and could therefore help psychoanalysis gain acceptance in the wider world, beyond the Jewish intellectual circles of Vienna. Jung, for his part, saw in Freud a revolutionary genius, a father figure whose approval he craved. They exchanged long letters, met for intense conversations, and Freud once famously fainted in Jung's presence during a heated discussion about ancient corpses in Egyptian tombs, an incident that both men interpreted symbolically, seeing in it the dynamics of succession and death wishes between generations. But the bond between Freud and Jung contained the seeds of its own destruction. Jung was interested in mysticism, religion, and the collective dimensions of the psyche in ways that made Freud uncomfortable. Freud wanted to keep psychoanalysis strictly scientific, rooted in sexuality and individual development, free of what he saw as religious obscurantism. Jung increasingly felt constrained by Freud's insistence on the centrality of sexuality, and he began to develop his own theories about archetypes and the collective unconscious that diverged from Freud's emphasis on personal history and repressed desires. The break came in 1913. After years of growing tension, Jung published work that Freud considered a betrayal of psychoanalytic principles, and they stopped speaking to each other. Freud experienced the split with Jung as a painful rejection, and he became more guarded afterward, more insistent on loyalty among his followers, quicker to see dissent as resistance or neurotic distortion. A secret committee was formed, a ring of loyalists who would guard the integrity of psychoanalytic theory against defection and revision. Alfred Adler had already broken away in 1911, disagreeing with Freud's emphasis on sexuality and proposing instead that the fundamental human drive was for power and superiority, a compensation for childhood feelings of weakness. Adler's departure was acrimonious, with Freud dismissing Adler's ideas as superficial and consciously resentful. Over the years, other followers would also leave or be expelled, including Otto Rank, who questioned the centrality of the Oedipus complex, and Sandor Ferenczi, who pushed for more warmth and emotional responsiveness from analysts. Freud could be magnanimous and generous, but he could also be authoritarian, intolerant of fundamental disagreements with what he considered the core insights of psychoanalysis. Throughout these years of building a movement and weathering schisms, Freud continued to refine his model of the mind. Initially, he had described the psyche in topographical terms: the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious. The unconscious contained repressed wishes and memories that were kept out of awareness by the force of repression. The preconscious held material that was not currently in awareness but could easily be brought to consciousness. And consciousness was the surface, the small portion of mental life that we directly experience. But by the 1920s, Freud felt this topographical model was insufficient, and he introduced a new structural model that divided the psyche into three agencies: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id was the reservoir of instinctual drives, the seething cauldron of libido and aggression, operating according to the pleasure principle and demanding immediate gratification. The id was unconscious, primitive, and amoral, the part of us that is simply a bundle of wants. The ego was the executive agency, the part of the mind that dealt with reality, that mediated between the demands of the id and the constraints of the external world. The ego operated according to the reality principle, postponing gratification, making plans, using reason and perception. The ego was partly conscious and partly unconscious, and much of its work involved defense, managing the anxiety that arose when id impulses threatened to break through into consciousness or action. The superego was the internalized voice of authority, the conscience, formed through identification with parental and cultural values. The superego contained the ego ideal, the image of who we should be, and it punished the ego with guilt when we fell short. The superego was harsh and uncompromising, often more cruel than any actual parent, and it too was largely unconscious. Many of the prohibitions and judgments it imposed operated automatically, outside awareness. The mind, in this model, was a theater of conflict. The ego was beset on all sides, pressured by the id's insatiable demands, constrained by external reality, and judged by the superego's harsh standards. Anxiety was the signal that the ego used to alert itself to danger, and defense mechanisms were the strategies the ego employed to manage anxiety and keep forbidden impulses out of consciousness. These defenses included repression, forcing thoughts into the unconscious; projection, attributing one's own unacceptable feelings to others; reaction formation, adopting beliefs that are the opposite of one's unconscious wishes; and sublimation, channeling instinctual energy into socially acceptable activities. Freud's evolving theory of mind was tested and illustrated through his clinical work, through the strange and compelling case studies that he published over the decades. Each case was a deep dive into the particulars of a single troubled soul, and each revealed something about the general mechanisms of psychic life. There was Dora, an 18-year-old woman brought to Freud by her father because she was suffering from depression, fatigue, and suicidal ideation. Dora had been caught up in a tangle of adult deception. Her father was having an affair with Frau K., the wife of a family friend, and Herr K., the husband, had made sexual advances toward Dora, perhaps with the tacit approval of Dora's father, who seemed to be offering his daughter as a quid pro quo for his own affair. Dora reported that Herr K. had kissed her when she was 14, which had filled her with disgust, and later he propositioned her explicitly, which she rejected. Freud analyzed Dora's symptoms as expressing her repressed desires and conflicts. He suggested that she was not simply a victim of Herr K.'s advances, but that she was unconsciously attracted to him and also to Frau K., and that her symptoms were the result of these conflicting feelings. When Freud pressed these interpretations, insisting that she really wanted Herr K., Dora abruptly terminated the treatment after only 3 months. Freud later acknowledged that he had failed to recognize the power of transference that Dora had transferred onto him. The feelings of betrayal and manipulation she felt from the adults in her life, and that, by siding with her father's interpretation of events, Freud had repeated the original trauma rather than helping her work through it. The case of the rat man concerned a young lawyer tormented by obsessional thoughts. He was haunted by an image of a torture, in which rats were placed in a pot attached to a person's buttocks, gnawing into the anus. This horrific image attached itself to the rat man's father and to a woman he loved, and he developed elaborate rituals to ward off the danger he imagined them to be in. Freud's analysis uncovered that the obsessional thoughts were a defense against the man's own hostile and sadistic impulses, and that the rat imagery was connected through chains of association to issues of money, anal eroticism, and ambivalence toward paternal authority. The case illustrated how the mechanisms of obsessional neurosis worked, how the mind could become imprisoned in loops of doubt and ritual as a way of managing unbearable impulses. The Wolfman was a wealthy Russian aristocrat who came to Freud suffering from severe neurosis. His analysis lasted several years and produced one of Freud's most famous case studies. The Wolfman reported a dream from childhood in which he saw 6 or 7 white wolves sitting in a tree outside his window, staring at him. Through painstaking analysis, Freud interpreted this dream as a screen memory, a symbolic representation of a primal scene the Wolfman had witnessed as a very small child, his parents having intercourse from behind, which the child interpreted as an act of aggression. The wolves, Freud suggested, represented the patient's parents and also his own aggressive and erotic impulses. The case was meant to demonstrate the reality of infantile sexuality and the power of early trauma to shape later development. Though critics have questioned whether Freud's interpretations were too speculative, too much a construction imposed on the patient rather than emerging from the patient's own understanding, these case studies were more than medical reports. They were stories, narratives of suffering and attempted cure, written with psychological insight and literary flair. Freud's writing style made psychoanalysis accessible to a general audience, and his cases became almost mythological, illustrative fables of how the unconscious operates. But they were also ethically complex. Freud published detailed information about his patients' lives, sometimes barely disguising their identities. He interpreted their dreams and symptoms according to his theory, sometimes over their objections. The relationship between analyst and patient, as depicted in these cases, was not one of equals collaborating toward insight, but of a detective uncovering hidden truths that the patient resisted acknowledging. What, then, was the psychoanalytic technique, the actual method by which this work was done? The setting itself was distinctive. The patient lay on a couch, with the analyst sitting out of view, behind the patient's head. This arrangement had practical origins. Freud had started his career using hypnosis and continued the reclined position, but he abandoned hypnosis because he wasn't very good at it, and because he came to believe that conscious collaboration was more effective than trance. The couch remained, however, and it served several purposes. It reduced the patient's anxiety about being stared at. It encouraged a more inward focus and free flow of thought, and it gave the analyst space to maintain a neutral, anonymous presence. The fundamental rule of psychoanalysis was free association. The patient was instructed to say everything that came to mind, without censorship, without trying to make sense or sound coherent, following each thought to the next, regardless of how trivial, embarrassing, or illogical it seemed. This is harder than it sounds. We are accustomed to editing our thoughts, presenting ourselves in a socially acceptable way, maintaining a logical thread. Free association asks the patient to lower these guards, to let the unconscious speak through the gaps and slips and unexpected turns of thought. The analyst, for their part, was to listen with evenly suspended attention, not focusing on any particular element, but attending to the whole flow, letting patterns and connections emerge. The analyst was to remain neutral, not imposing their own values or judgments, not gratifying the patient's wishes or punishing their transgressions. This neutrality was not coldness, but a kind of disciplined openness, a holding of space in which the patient's inner world could unfold without interference. But the analyst was not passive. At the right moments, the analyst would intervene with interpretations, pointing out connections the patient had missed, suggesting unconscious meanings, bringing into awareness the defenses and resistances that were keeping certain material hidden. The art of interpretation was delicate. Offered too early, an interpretation would be rejected, would provoke anxiety and resistance. Offered at the right moment, when the patient was close to the insight themselves, an interpretation could produce a shift, a sudden sense of recognition, an ah yes that carried emotional conviction. Two phenomena were central to the therapeutic process: transference and resistance. Transference was the patient's unconscious repetition of old relationship patterns in the relationship with the analyst. The patient might come to see the analyst as a withholding father, a seductive mother, a rivalrous sibling, and would react to the analyst as if they were actually that figure from the past. This transference was not a mistake or a distraction, but the very core of the therapeutic work. In the transference, the patient's conflicts became alive and present in the room, and they could be examined and worked through in a way that mere discussion of the past could not achieve. Resistance was any force that opposed the work of bringing the unconscious into consciousness. Resistance took many forms. The patient might forget appointments, might fall silent, might intellectualize without feeling, might become angry at the analyst, might flood the session with irrelevant details. But resistance was not simply an obstacle to be overcome. It was information, a sign that the analysis was approaching something significant, something the patient's defenses were mobilized to protect. The analysis of resistance was as important as the analysis of dreams or symptoms. A typical psychoanalysis in Freud's time might last several years, with sessions occurring 5 or 6 times per week. The process was intense, demanding, and often painful. Patients experienced what Freud called the transference neurosis, a period when their symptoms might actually worsen as Analysis stirred up old conflicts, but through this intensification, through the repeated working through of patterns in the transference, the hope was that the patient would achieve insight, would integrate previously split-off parts of themselves, and would gain greater freedom and flexibility in their emotional life. Did it work? The answer was and remains complicated. Some patients reported profound benefit, a sense of self-understanding and liberation. Others felt harmed, felt that their symptoms were unchanged or worsened, felt that the analyst had imposed interpretations that were not true to their experience. Psychoanalysis was not a quick fix, not a reliable cure in the medical sense. It was a journey of exploration, an attempt to expand consciousness and reduce the tyranny of unconscious repetition, but it offered no guarantees. Freud himself became more pessimistic about therapeutic outcomes as he aged. In his later papers, he wrote about the limitations of analysis, about the rock bottom of biology, about constitutional factors and the power of the death drive that might resist all efforts at cure. But he remained convinced that the truth was valuable in itself, that self-knowledge was worthwhile even if it didn't always bring relief from suffering. As Freud's clinical and theoretical work progressed, he began to turn his attention outward, applying psychoanalytic concepts to the broader questions of culture, religion, and civilization. He had always believed that individual psychology and collective phenomena were continuous, that the same mechanisms operated in both. If the individual psyche was shaped by the repression of infantile wishes, then perhaps civilization itself was built on a massive collective repression. In 1913, Freud published Totem and Taboo, a speculative work that drew on anthropology, mythology, and psychoanalysis to propose a theory of the origins of human culture. Freud took seriously the findings of Freud acts of time. Anthropologists like James Frazer, who had documented the prevalence of totemism in tribal societies, systems in which a clan identified with an animal or natural object, treating it as sacred and forbidding its killing or eating except on ritual occasions. Freud suggested that totemism was a vestige of a primal event in human prehistory. He imagined a scenario in which early humans lived in primal hordes, dominated by a tyrannical father who monopolized all the women and drove away or killed his sons when they reached maturity. The sons, driven by sexual desire and resentment, eventually banded together and killed and ate the father in a cannibalistic feast. But after the father was dead, the sons were overwhelmed with guilt. They had loved the father even as they hated him, and his murder left them haunted. To atone for their crime and to prevent the cycle from repeating, the sons instituted the first laws. They forbade the killing of the totem animal, which represented the profaned father, and they imposed the incest taboo, renouncing the women of their own clan. These prohibitions became the foundation of morality and culture. Religion, Freud argued, was essentially the worship of the murdered father, an attempt to appease his ghost and manage collective guilt. Civilization was built on the repression of parricide and incest, and the tension between instinct and prohibition was the driving force of cultural development. Totem and taboo was widely criticized, even by Freud's supporters, as speculative and scientifically unfounded. There was no evidence of an actual primal murder, and the Lamarckian assumption that psychological experiences could be inherited seemed dubious even then. But Freud was not really writing history in the empirical sense. He was constructing a myth, a just-so story that captured psychological truths about ambivalence, guilt, and the origins of conscience. The primal father was a symbol, and the usefulness of the theory lay in the way. It illuminated the psychological underpinnings of taboo, ritual, and moral feeling. The First World War, which began in 1914, shattered the optimism of the pre-war era. Freud watched as the nations of Europe tore each other apart, as millions died in trenches, as civilization revealed itself to be a thin veneer over primitive aggression. The war confirmed for Freud the power of destructive instincts, the ease with which the work of centuries could be undone. In 1920, Freud published Beyond the Pleasure Principle, a dark and speculative work that introduced a fundamental revision to his theory of drives. Previously, Freud had thought of human motivation in terms of libido, the sexual life instinct, which sought pleasure and the preservation of life. But the war, and his observation of traumatic neuroses in soldiers, led him to posit a second fundamental drive, the death drive, or thanatos. The death drive was the instinct to return to an earlier state, ultimately to the inorganic state, to the stillness and safety of non-existence. It manifested as aggression, destructiveness, and a compulsion to repeat painful experiences. Freud observed that trauma victims would relive their traumatic experiences in dreams and waking life, not for pleasure but compulsively, as if driven by a force beyond the pleasure principle. He suggested that there was something in the organism that pulled toward dissolution, toward destruction, and that this death drive was as fundamental as the life drive. The duality of eros and thanatos, love and death, became a central theme of Freud's later work. He saw all of life as a battle between these two forces, with civilization itself being the arena of their struggle. Civilization required the taming and redirection of instincts, particularly aggression, but this taming came at a cost. In 1930, Freud published Civilization and Its Discontents, one of his most famous works and a profound meditation on the inescapable tension between individual happiness and social order. The book began with a letter from the French writer Romain Rolland, who had described a feeling he called the oceanic feeling, a sense of boundless connection with the universe, which Rolland saw as the true source of religious sentiment. Freud admitted he couldn't relate to this feeling himself, but he speculated that it might be a remnant of infantile consciousness, a memory of the time before the ego differentiated itself from the world, when the infant at the breast felt merged with the mother, unbounded and safe. But this oceanic feeling, Freud argued, was an illusion, a regression to an earlier state. The reality of human life was one of separation, of individual egos navigating a difficult and often hostile world. And civilization, the great edifice of culture and law and social cooperation, was built on the renunciation of instinct. To live together, people had to give up many of their desires. Aggression had to be controlled, sexuality regulated, individual gratification postponed for the sake of the collective good. This renunciation, Freud argued, was the source of widespread discontent. People were not happier in civilized society. In many ways, they were more neurotic, more plagued by guilt and anxiety, because so much of their instinctual life was forbidden expression. The superego, the internalized moral authority, turned aggression inward, directing it against the self in the form of guilt and self-punishment. The more civilized we became, the more guilty we felt, the more we suffered from a vague sense of unease and dissatisfaction. Freud did not advocate for the abandonment of civilization or a return to some primitive state of nature. That was neither possible nor desirable, but he wanted to make clear that progress came with a cost, that there was no solution to the fundamental conflict between instinct and culture, no way to have both complete freedom and social order. The best we could hope for was a livable compromise, a reduction of unnecessary repression, and a clearer awareness of the forces at work within us. As the 1930s progressed, the political situation in Europe darkened. Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, and anti-Semitism, which had always been a background presence in Freud's life, became a state-sponsored campaign of persecution. Psychoanalysis was labeled a Jewish science, and Freud's books were burned in the public squares of Berlin. Analysts fled Germany and Austria, scattering to London, New York, and beyond. Freud remained in Vienna even as the danger increased. He was in his late 70s, suffering from oral cancer, the result of his lifelong cigar smoking. He had undergone multiple surgeries, and he wore a prosthetic device in his mouth that made eating and speaking difficult and painful. He continued to see patients, to write, and to manage the psychoanalytic movement from his apartment. At Burgas 19, surrounded by his collection of ancient artifacts, small statues and figures from Egypt, Greece, and Rome that crowded his desk and shelves, silent witnesses to the long history of human culture and its recurring themes. In March of 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and the Nazis took control of Vienna. Freud's apartment was raided by the SA, and his daughter Anna was detained and questioned by the Gestapo for a day, an experience that terrified the family. It became clear that Freud could no longer stay. With the help of international colleagues and diplomats, including President Roosevelt's intervention, exit visas were secured. In June of 1938, Freud, his wife Martha, his daughter Anna, and his household left Vienna by train for Paris and then London. The departure was heartbreaking. Freud was leaving the city that had been his home for nearly 80 years, the place where he had built his life and his life's work. 4 of his elderly sisters remained in Vienna, unable or unwilling to emigrate, and they would later perish in the concentration camps, victims of the Holocaust. In London, Freud was received with honor and respect. He settled in a house at 20 Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead, a pleasant neighborhood far from the anxieties of Vienna. His consulting room was recreated, his antiquities unpacked and arranged, the famous couch positioned once more. Visitors came to pay their respects. Writers, scientists, fellow émigrés. Freud continued to work on what would be his final book, Moses and Monotheism, a speculative and controversial work that applied psychoanalytic ideas to the origins of Judaism, arguing that Moses was actually an Egyptian and that the monotheistic religion was founded on another instance of parricide, the murder of Moses by the Jewish people. But Freud's cancer was advancing, and he was in constant pain. He had made his doctor, Max Schur, promise years earlier that when the time came, he would not let him suffer unnecessarily. In September of 1939, with the Second World War just begun, Freud told Schur that he was ready, that there was no more point to suffering. Schur administered doses of morphine, and on September 23, 1939, Sigmund Freud died, 3 weeks short of his 83rd birthday. He left behind a body of work that had permanently altered the landscape of human thought. Psychoanalysis had its critics, its limitations, its blind spots, but it had given the world a new vocabulary for the inner life. Terms like unconscious, repression, defense mechanism, projection, transference, Oedipal complex, and Freudian slip had entered common language, shaping how people thought about themselves and each other. The idea that childhood experiences matter, that hidden motives drive behavior, that dreams and slips carry meaning, that sexuality is central to psychological life. These notions became part of the air we breathe, so fundamental that we can forget how revolutionary they once were. Now let us slow our pace even further. Let us sink deeper into the ideas themselves, into the substance of what Freud discovered or invented or imagined about the workings of the human mind. For psychoanalysis is not just a set of biographical facts about one man's life, but a method of inquiry, a way of listening, a systematic exploration of the shadowlands where consciousness fears to tread. At the heart of Freudian thought is the concept of the unconscious, and yet this word can mislead us if we think of it as simply a place, a basement of the mind where forgotten things are stored. The unconscious, for Freud, is not passive storage, but an active system, a realm of psychic life that operates according to its own logic, indifferent to reason, time, and contradiction. In the unconscious, opposite wishes coexist without conflict. The unconscious knows no negation, no maybe, no later. It operates in a timeless present, where childhood desires remain as vivid and urgent as they were decades ago. The discovery of the unconscious was not Freud's alone. Poets and mystics had always known that much of life happens below the threshold of awareness. But Freud systematized this insight, showed how the unconscious could be investigated, how its contents and mechanisms could be inferred from dreams, symptoms, and slips, how it followed laws that could be mapped. He made the unconscious scientifically respectable, or at least attempted to, giving it a mechanism: repression. Repression is the active process by which thoughts, feelings, and memories that are too painful or threatening are pushed out of consciousness. But repression is not perfect. The repressed material continues to exert pressure, to seek expression, and it returns in disguised forms, in dreams, in neurotic symptoms, in irrational fears and compulsions, in slips of the tongue. The human mind is a pressure system, with forces pushing up from below and forces pushing down from above, and consciousness is the narrow strait between them, the compromised space where only certain carefully vetted material is allowed through. Why do we repress? Because certain truths are unbearable. A child cannot afford to consciously hate the parent on whom their survival depends. A person cannot hold on to an image of themselves as good while also acknowledging their destructive wishes. A society cannot function if everyone acts on every impulse. And so the mind learns to lie to itself, to hide things from itself, to create a sanitized version of self for public and even private consumption. The cost of repression is neurosis. The repressed material doesn't disappear. It festers. It grows in the dark. It finds outlet in symptoms that perplex and torment. A woman develops a paralyzed arm with no medical cause. A man is gripped by obsessive thoughts he cannot escape. A child develops inexplicable anxieties and phobias. These symptoms are communications, messages in code from the unconscious saying, "Here, look here, there is something you will not face, and I will force you to pay attention by making your life unlivable until you do." Freud's genius was in learning to read these messages, to decode the symptoms and dreams and slips, to follow the associative threads back to their source. And the technique he developed, psychoanalysis, was fundamentally an archaeology, a digging down through layers of psychic sediment to reach the buried past. But the past that psychoanalysis uncovers is not a simple, objective history. Memory, Freud discovered, is unreliable, shaped by fantasy and desire, revised and reconstructed with each recollection. What matters therapeutically is not the factual truth of what happened, but the psychological truth of what it meant, how it was experienced, how it continues to shape current feelings and relationships. This insight has made psychoanalysis controversial. If we cannot trust memory, if the analyst helps construct a narrative rather than simply recovering a buried one, then how do we know what is real? How do we distinguish between actual trauma and imagined trauma, between history and fantasy? Freud's answer was that, in the realm of the psyche, fantasy is as real as fact. A child who fantasizes about being seduced, who wishes for the parent's exclusive love, who imagines violence and revenge, these fantasies have psychological consequences just as powerful as actual events. The psychic reality is what matters, and psychoanalysis is an exploration of that inner reality, not a forensic investigation of external facts. Central to this inner reality are the drives, the basic instinctual forces that motivate human behavior. Freud's theory of drives evolved over his lifetime, but in its final form, it proposed two fundamental instincts: eros, the life drive, encompassing sexuality, love, and self-preservation, the force that seeks connection, pleasure, and the continuation of life; and thanatos, the death drive, the instinct toward destruction, aggression, and a return to inorganic quiescence. The life drive, eros, was easier to accept, more compatible with common sense. Of course, humans seek pleasure, seek connection, seek to survive and reproduce. But the death drive was a darker and more controversial idea. Why would organisms have an instinct toward their own destruction? Freud's reasoning was partly biological, partly philosophical. He noted that all organisms eventually return to the inorganic state, that death is the ultimate destination of all life. He observed the compulsion to repeat painful experiences, the way people seemed drawn to suffering, the aggressive and self-destructive behaviors that couldn't be explained by the pleasure principle alone. Perhaps, Freud speculated, there is in every organism a pull back toward the stability of the inorganic, a resistance to the tension and excitation of life itself. Life is a detour on the path to death, and the death drive is the conservative instinct that seeks the shortest route back. In its outward form, the death drive appears as aggression, the urge to destroy external objects. In its inward form, it appears as self-punishment, guilt, depression, the superego's harsh attacks on the ego. The interplay of eros and thanatos, Freud argued, was the fundamental dynamic of all life. Civilization was the sublimation of eros, the channeling of sexual and aggressive energy into productive social forms, art, science, law, culture. But civilization also intensified the death drive, turning aggression inward, creating ever more powerful superegos that tormented individuals with guilt. The more civilized we became, the more we suffered, because the more we had to renounce our instinctual life. This was a tragic vision, and Freud embraced its tragic quality. There was no happy ending. no final resolution to the conflicts of human existence. We are creatures caught between impossible demands, the demands of our instincts, the demands of reality, the demands of our internalized moral codes. The best we can do is achieve a workable compromise, a way of living that doesn't require too much repression and allows for some expression of our needs, while still enabling us to function in the social world. Dreams, in this system, are one of the psyche's great compromise formations. They are the place where forbidden wishes can be fulfilled in disguised form, where the unconscious speaks without fully waking the conscious mind. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, because they offer the most direct access to unconscious processes. But it is a road that requires careful interpretation, because the dream hides as much as it reveals. The content of a dream, as we remember it, is the manifest content, the story or series of images that we can report. But beneath this lies the latent content, the actual dream thoughts, the wishes and fears that the dream is expressing. The transformation of latent content into manifest content is accomplished by the dream work, the set of operations that disguise and distort the latent thoughts to make them acceptable. Condensation is the process by which multiple ideas, feelings, or figures from waking life are combined into a single dream image. A person in a dream might have the face of one acquaintance, the voice of another, and the clothing of a third, because the dream is using that single figure to represent multiple associations. Condensation allows the dream to pack enormous amounts of meaning into brief scenes, giving dreams their characteristic density and ambiguity. Displacement shifts the emotional intensity from its true object to something less significant. You might dream of losing your keys and feel intense anxiety, when the actual anxiety is about something far more important, a relationship, a failure, a fear of death. The mind displaces the feeling onto something trivial, something that won't wake you up with its intensity. Secondary revision is the process by which the ego tries to make the dream into a coherent story. Dreams, in their raw form, are often fragmentary and nonsensical, but we want them to make sense, so we smooth over the gaps, add connections, create a narrative. This revision happens partly during the dream itself, and partly when we try to remember and recount the dream upon waking. It is the part of the mind that cannot tolerate incoherence, trying to impose order on the productions of the unconscious. And then there is symbolism, the way dreams use images to represent ideas and feelings. Some symbols, Freud argued, are relatively universal, shaped by shared human experiences and the structure of language. Long objects, he famously suggested, often represent the male genital. Enclosed spaces represent the female genital. Climbing stairs or flying might represent sexual intercourse. Water might represent birth. These symbolic equations were based on linguistic associations, on the way metaphors work in language and myth. But Freud also insisted that symbol interpretation could never be mechanical, that the meaning of a symbol always depended on the individual dreamer's associations. One had to ask the dreamer what the image meant to them, what memories and feelings it evoked. The interpretation of dreams was an art, not a science, requiring sensitivity to nuance and an openness to multiple meanings. When we examine Freud's major case studies, we see the method in action, and we also see its limitations and controversies. Take the case of Dora, which Freud published in 1905 under the title Fragment of an Analysis of a Case of Hysteria. Dora was 18 years old when she came to treatment, suffering from coughing fits, loss of voice, depression, and what her father described as suicidal threats. Her father brought her to Freud, hoping he would talk her out of her accusations that he was having an affair with Frau K. As Freud elicited the details, a complex and disturbing picture emerged. Dora's father was indeed having an affair with Frau K, and her K, Frau K's husband, had been making advances toward Dora since she was 14. The two couples, Dora's parents and the K's, were entangled in a web of mutual dependence and exploitation. Her K had kissed Dora forcibly when she was 14, and she had felt disgust. Later, when she was 16, he propositioned her explicitly, saying, as Freud recounts, that he got nothing from his wife, implying that Dora should provide what Frau K did not. Dora's symptoms began after she slapped her K and rejected him. Her father didn't believe her account, or chose not to, because acknowledging it would threaten his relationship with Frau K. He brought Dora to Freud to be fixed, to be made compliant. Freud's interpretation was that Dora was not simply a victim, but was caught in her own ambivalence. He suggested that she was unconsciously attracted to her K, that her disgust at his kiss was a reversal of her real feeling, that she wanted him even as she rejected him. He also suggested that she was in love with Frau K, that her attachment to the older woman had erotic components, and he interpreted her symptoms as expressing her repressed sexuality and her rage at the adults who were using her as a pawn. When Dora terminated treatment abruptly after 3 months, Freud initially interpreted it as an act of revenge, a way of abandoning him as she felt abandoned by others. But later, in a postscript, he acknowledged that he had failed to recognize the dynamics of transference quickly enough. That Dora had transferred onto him her feelings about the men who had betrayed her, and that by pushing his interpretations about her unconscious desires, he had repeated the experience of not being believed, of being told that she really wanted what she said she didn't want. The case of Dora has become a flashpoint for debates about psychoanalysis. Feminist critics have pointed out that Freud seemed more interested in proving his theory than in listening to the young woman, that he blamed the victim for her own abuse, that he sided with the patriarchal structure that was exploiting her. The case shows both the power and the danger of interpretation. Freud saw things that others missed: the complexity of desire, the reality of unconscious motivation, the way trauma can be both external and internal. But he also imposed his framework, sometimes ignoring the patient's own voice, sometimes making the theory more important than the person. The Rat Man case, published in 1909 as Notes upon a Case of Obsessional Neurosis, tells the story of a man tormented by obsessive thoughts and compulsive rituals. The patient, a lawyer whose real name was Ernst Lanzer, came to Freud suffering from an obsession that had started after hearing about a form of torture in which rats were placed in a pot attached to a person's buttocks. The image horrified him, but it kept intruding into his mind, and he began to fear that this torture would be inflicted on his father and on a woman he loved. To ward off this imagined danger, the Rat Man developed elaborate rituals. He had to perform certain actions, had to pay back debts in a specific way, had to avoid certain thoughts. The rituals became so consuming that they interfered with his ability to function. Freud's analysis traced the symptoms back to childhood conflicts around anality, sexuality, and aggression. The rat image, through chains of linguistic and symbolic association, connected to money, to anal eroticism, to the patient's rage at his father, and to his ambivalent feelings about marriage and sexuality. Freud showed how obsessional neurosis worked as a defense system. The patient's aggressive and erotic impulses were unacceptable to his superego, and so they were transformed into their opposite excessive concern and protective rituals. But the rituals never worked because the underlying impulses remained constantly threatening to break through. The patient was trapped in a loop of doubt, unable to trust his own actions or thoughts, because every action might be secretly expressing the forbidden wish. The case illustrated the mechanisms of obsessional thinking: intellectualization, isolation of affect, undoing, and displacement. The rat man could think about torture and death, but not feel the emotions connected to those thoughts. He could perform rituals to undo actions that symbolically expressed forbidden wishes. He could displace his concerns onto trivial matters, whether he had paid the correct person, the correct amount of money, while avoiding the real issues. His ambivalence about his father, his conflicted feelings about women, his terror of his own aggression. Freud reported that the rat man's treatment was successful, that after about a year, tired of analysis, the obsessional symptoms were largely resolved. But the case had a tragic coda. Ernst Lanzer was killed in World War I, dying in battle before he could enjoy the benefits of his analysis, a reminder that therapeutic success, when it comes, does not protect us from the larger tragedies of history. The Wolfman, whose real name was Sergei Pankachev, was a wealthy Russian aristocrat who came to Freud in 1910 suffering from severe neurosis that rendered him unable to function. His analysis lasted from 1910 to 1914, and it became the subject of one of Freud's most detailed and controversial case studies, published in 1918 as From the History of an Infantile Neurosis. The centerpiece of the case was the wolf dream, a nightmare Sergei had when he was about 4 years old. In the dream, he woke up in his bed and saw the window open by itself. Outside, sitting in a large walnut tree, were 6 or 7 white wolves staring at him intently. He was terrified and woke screaming. The dream had haunted him ever since. Freud spent months analyzing this dream, eliciting Sergei's associations, building a complex interpretation. He concluded that the dream was a symbolic representation of a primal scene Sergei had witnessed when he was very young, perhaps 18 months old. According to Freud's reconstruction, Sergei had seen his parents having intercourse from behind, which he interpreted as an act of aggression, the father attacking the mother. The wolves in the dream represented the parents. Their whiteness and immobility were reversals of the actual scene's movement and nakedness, and their staring eyes replicated the child's own wide-eyed witnessing of the primal scene. This interpretation was meant to demonstrate several key psychoanalytic principles: the reality of infantile sexuality, the importance of early childhood experiences in shaping later neurosis, the way traumatic memories are transformed and disguised in dreams, and the Oedipal dynamics of desire and fear. But the interpretation was also highly speculative. Could a child of 18 months really remember such a scene? Was Freud reconstructing an actual memory or constructing a theoretical scenario that fit his theory? The Wolfman's later life added further complexity. After Freud, Sergei was analyzed by other analysts, and he gave interviews in which he expressed ambivalence about whether Freud's interpretations were correct. He said the analysis had helped him, but also that some of Freud's conclusions seemed forced, that Freud had been more interested in proving his theories than in understanding Sergei as an individual. The Wolfman lived a long life, dying in 1979, and he remained entangled with psychoanalysis, a living specimen of Freud's work, both a testimony to its power and a question mark about its validity. These case studies, read today, are disturbing in their intimacy and their authority. Freud exposes his patients' most private thoughts, their sexual fantasies, their shameful desires, and he does so in the service of science, of building a theory of mind. The ethical standards of the time were different, and Freud did attempt to disguise identities, but the disguises were often transparent. The patients themselves sometimes had complicated feelings about being immortalized in Freud's texts, being turned into illustrations of psychoanalytic principles. But the cases are also remarkable literary achievements. Freud writes with psychological insight and narrative skill, creating characters who live on the page, whose suffering feels real and compelling. The cases read like detective stories, with Freud following clues, uncovering hidden connections, arriving at startling conclusions. They have influenced not just psychology, but literature, the way stories are told, the way character is understood. Writers from Thomas Mann to Philip Roth have absorbed Freud's vision of the mind as a theater of conflict, his sense of the depths beneath the surface, the technique of psychoanalysis, as Freud practiced and taught it, rested on several key elements. Free association was the fundamental rule. The patient was to say everything that came to mind without censorship. This was harder than it sounded, because social convention, shame, and the ego's defenses all worked against it. The patient would start to say something and then stop, would report a dream and then dismiss it as trivial, would change the subject just as something important was emerging. These resistances were not obstacles to be bulldozed, but information, signs that the analysis was approaching sensitive material. The analyst was to listen with evenly suspended attention, not focusing on any particular detail, but allowing the whole to come into view, attending to patterns and repetitions. The analyst was to maintain a neutral, abstinent stance, not gratifying the patient's wishes, not offering advice or moral judgment, not revealing their own personality or values. This neutrality was meant to create a blank screen onto which the patient could project their transferences, their old relationship patterns. Interpretation was the analyst's main tool. At the right moment, the analyst would offer an interpretation, pointing out a connection, suggesting an unconscious meaning, bringing into awareness something the patient had been defending against. The interpretation had to be timed carefully. Too early, and it would be rejected, would provoke resistance. Too late, and the moment would be lost. The art of psychoanalysis was in this timing, this sensitivity to where the patient was in the process. Transference, the patient's unconscious repetition of past relationships in the relationship with the analyst, was both the engine of the therapeutic process and the most challenging aspect of the work. The patient might fall in love with the analyst, or hate the analyst, or become dependent, or become defiant. And these feelings, while they felt like responses to the analyst as a real person, were actually expressions of old patterns. The analyst, by remaining neutral and not reciprocating these feelings, allowed them to be examined, allowed the patient to see that they were bringing something from the past into the present. But maintaining neutrality was difficult, and Freud acknowledged that analysts were not immune to their own countertransference, their own emotional reactions to patients. Initially, Freud thought countertransference was a problem to be eliminated through the analyst's own analysis. Later, analysts would come to see countertransference as valuable information, as a way of understanding what the patient was unconsciously communicating. The psychoanalytic session had a distinctive rhythm and atmosphere. The patient lay on the couch, which was often covered with richly patterned fabrics and cushions, comfortable but not too comfortable. A place that was not quite bed and not quite chair, a liminal space that encouraged a state somewhere between waking and dreaming. The analyst sat behind the patient, out of view. A presence felt more than seeing, a listening ear, a mind attending to the flow of words. The room was quiet, insulated from the noise of the outside world. Time slowed. The patient spoke, sometimes freely, sometimes with great difficulty, reporting dreams, describing memories, expressing feelings, going silent, starting again. The analyst occasionally spoke, asking a question, offering an interpretation, but much of the time the analyst was simply there, a witness, a container for whatever emerged. There was something ritualistic about it, something that evoked ancient practices of confession, of seeking wisdom from an oracle, of descending into the underworld and returning transformed. Psychoanalysis was a secular ritual for a secular age, a way of tending to the soul without invoking religion, of seeking meaning and healing through the talking cure. Did it work? The evidence was and remains mixed. Some people reported profound transformation, a sense of coming to know themselves in a way that liberated them from old patterns. Others felt the process was interminable, that it went in circles, that the analyst's interpretations were arbitrary or imposed. Still, others felt harmed, felt that the analysis had stirred up pain without resolving it, or that the power dynamics of the relationship were exploitative. Freud himself became increasingly pessimistic about therapeutic outcomes. In his late paper, Analysis Terminable and Interminable, written in 1937, he acknowledged that analysis often did not achieve complete cure, that some conflicts were intractable, that there were constitutional and biological factors that set limits on what psychological work could accomplish. He spoke of the rock bottom of biology, the fundamental resistance of instincts to modification. He wondered whether analysis was ever truly finished, or whether it was a process that could go on indefinitely without reaching a final resolution. And yet, Freud remained convinced that the effort was worthwhile, that self-knowledge was valuable even if it didn't always bring relief, that understanding the forces that shaped us was better than living in ignorance of them. Psychoanalysis, in this view, was not primarily a medical treatment, but a form of enlightenment, a way of expanding consciousness, of making the unconscious conscious, of gaining a degree of freedom from the compulsions of the past. Freud's writings on culture and society extended his psychological insights to the collective level. In Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, published in 1921, he explored how individuals in groups behave differently than individuals alone, how the group mind operates according to more primitive principles, how leaders exploit the group's longing for a father figure. He saw in mass movements, whether political or religious, the same dynamics that operated in individual psychology: identification, projection, regression to infantile states of dependence. In The Future of an Illusion, published in 1927, Freud took on religion, arguing that religious beliefs were illusions, wish fulfillments born from humanity's sense of helplessness in the face of nature and mortality. The idea of a protective father god was a projection of childhood feelings about the actual father, magnified and extended to the cosmos. Religion, Freud argued, was a kind of collective neurosis, a defense against anxiety that came at the cost of reality testing and intellectual honesty. He hoped that humanity would eventually outgrow its need for religion, that science and reason would provide a more mature foundation for ethics and meaning. But Freud was not naively optimistic about the prospects for reason. Civilization and its discontents made clear that there were no easy solutions, that the conflict between instinct and civilization was fundamental and enduring. Human beings were not naturally good, not naturally inclined to cooperate and love. They were driven by aggressive and selfish impulses, and civilization required the constant effort of suppression and sublimation. The veneer of culture was thin, and it could crack under pressure, as the First World War had shown. The rise of fascism in the 1930s seemed to confirm Freud's darkest insights. Here was a mass movement built on aggression, on the projection of hostility onto scapegoats, on the worship of a leader who promised to restore paternal authority and national greatness. The Nazis' persecution of Jews, their book burnings, their cult of violence, all of it could be understood in psychoanalytic terms as a regression to primitive instincts, a collective acting out of sadistic and destructive drives. Freud had always been pessimistic, but the last decade of his life deepened that pessimism. In his late writings, he returned again and again to the theme of the death drive, to the human capacity for cruelty and self-destruction, to the limits of what reason and love could achieve. Yet even in his darkest moments, he continued to work, to write, to see patients, to believe that understanding mattered, that bringing things to consciousness was better than leaving them in the dark. When we step back and survey the whole edifice of Freud's thought, what do we see? We see a system that is intricate and comprehensive, a theory that tries to account for the full range of human experience, from birth to death, from dreams to wars, from individual symptoms to the fate of civilizations. We see a mind that was unafraid to speculate, to follow ideas to their conclusions, to propose bold theories on the basis of limited evidence. We also see the limitations and controversies. Freud's theory was heavily gendered, reflecting the patriarchal assumptions of his time. His ideas about female sexuality, about penis envy, and women's supposedly weaker superego have been widely criticized as projecting male anxieties and fantasies, rather than describing any universal truth. Psychoanalysis, as Freud practiced, it was a theory built largely from the experiences of educated, middle-class, European men and women, and it may not generalize to other cultures and contexts. The scientific status of psychoanalysis has been endlessly debated. Is it a science in the sense of physics or biology, making testable predictions and subjecting itself to empirical verification? Or is it more like a hermeneutic discipline, an art of interpretation that operates in the realm of meaning rather than mechanism? Freud wanted psychoanalysis to be scientific, to be recognized as a natural science of the mind. But his method, clinical observation, interpretation of verbal reports and dreams, reconstruction of childhood from adult symptoms, does not easily yield to controlled experiments and quantitative measurement. Critics have charged that psychoanalytic theories are unfalsifiable, that any evidence can be interpreted to fit the theory. If a patient denies having an Oedipus complex, the analyst can say the denial is evidence of repression. If the patient agrees, the analyst can say the awareness confirms the theory. This circularity makes it difficult to know what would count as evidence against psychoanalytic claims. There are also concerns about suggestion and authority. How much of what emerges in analysis is discovered, and how much is created by the analytic process itself? When an analyst repeatedly interprets a patient's material in Oedipal terms, does the patient begin to produce material that fits that framework? Not because it's true, but because of the dynamics of compliance and suggestion? The relationship between analyst and patient is inherently unequal, and the potential for the analyst to impose their beliefs on the patient is real. And yet, for all these critiques, psychoanalysis has had an undeniable impact. It changed the way we think about childhood, about memory, about motivation, about the relationship between mind and body. It gave us a vocabulary for the inner life, a way of talking about feelings and conflicts that had previously been inexpressible. It influenced literature, art, film, and popular culture, shaping the 20th century's understanding of what it means to be human. The idea of the unconscious, however we define it, is now part of common sense. We accept that people don't always know why they do what they do, that hidden motives operate beneath the surface, that past experiences shape present behavior in ways we don't fully recognize. We understand that relationships are complex, that we bring old patterns into new situations, that love and hate can be intertwined. These insights, which Freud articulated and systematized, have become part of the water we swim in. Psychoanalysis also pioneered a form of deep, sustained attention to another person's inner life. The therapeutic relationship, at its best, offers something rare. A space where you can be fully yourself, where you can express thoughts and feelings that you can't express anywhere else, where you are not judged but understood. This is not unique to psychoanalysis. Other therapeutic approaches offer this as well, but psychoanalysis was one of the first to make this kind of listening the center of the healing process. In the landscape of psychological thought, Freud stands as a towering figure, both revered and contested. His successors have modified, expanded, and sometimes rejected his ideas. The object relations school, developed by Melanie Klein, Donald Winnicott, and others, shifted emphasis from drives to relationships, from intrapsychic conflict to the internalized templates of connection formed in infancy. Self-psychology, pioneered by Heinz Kohut, focused on the need for empathy and mirroring rather than on instinctual gratification. Relational psychoanalysis moved away from the analyst's neutrality toward a more interactive, mutual model of the therapeutic relationship. Contemporary psychoanalysis looks quite different from classical Freudianism. Many analysts no longer insist on the couch, no longer see 5 times a week, no longer adhere strictly to the drive theory or the Oedipus complex. There is more attention to attachment, to trauma, to culture and social context, to the diversity of human experience beyond the narrow confines of Freud's consulting room. And yet, the core insights remain vital. The idea that much of mental life is unconscious, the recognition that early experiences shape later development, the understanding that symptoms and behaviors carry symbolic meaning, the attention to transference and countertransference as sources of information about relational patterns, the commitment to helping people gain insight into their own minds, to expand the reach of consciousness, to live with greater freedom and choice. Freud gave us a way of seeing, a method for looking beneath the surface, for asking what a symptom means, what a dream is saying, what a slip might reveal. He taught us that the mind is not transparent to itself, that we are strangers to ourselves in important ways, and that the journey towards self-knowledge is difficult, ongoing, and necessary. Let us now drift into a broader contemplation, a more lyrical reflection on what all of this means, on how Freud's vision of the mind fits into the larger questions of human existence, on the place of psychoanalysis in the long history of humanity's attempt to know itself. Since the beginning of self-reflective consciousness, humans have been puzzled by the experience of being a self. Who am I? Why do I do what I do? What forces move me? The ancient Greeks inscribed on the temple at Delphi the command, "Know thyself." But how? Through philosophy, through religion, through introspection? Each culture has developed its own technologies of the self, its own ways of exploring inner experience and seeking transformation. Freud's psychoanalysis was one such technology, a child of the European Enlightenment and its faith in reason, but also a recognition of reason's limits, of the dark continent within that resists illumination. In this sense, psychoanalysis sits at a hinge point in Western thought, looking both forward to modern psychology and neuroscience, and backward to older traditions of confession, pilgrimage, and initiation. The descent into the unconscious that psychoanalysis proposes is reminiscent of the ancient mystery cults, the rites of Eleusis, the descent of Inanna into the underworld, the hero's journey into the belly of the whale. These myths depicted a necessary passage through darkness, a confrontation with death and the shadow, and a return transformed. Psychoanalysis secularized this journey, turned it into a therapeutic process. But the structure remained mythic. You must go down before you can go up. You must face what you fear and have avoided. You must dismantle the false self to find the true self. Freud himself was ambivalent about mysticism and spirituality. He saw religion as illusion, saw mystical experiences as regressions to infantile states of merger. He wanted to keep psychoanalysis rational, scientific, free of what he called the black tide of occultism. And yet, the process he described, the slow unveiling of hidden truths, the confrontation with one's own darkness, the transformation through insight, has a quality of initiation, of spiritual practice. This is why Freud's ideas resonated beyond the medical community, why artists and writers and seekers were drawn to them. Psychoanalysis offered a map of the inner world at a time when traditional religious maps were losing their authority. It provided a way to talk about guilt and desire, about the struggle between different parts of the self, about the possibility of redemption through understanding. It offered, in short, a secular soteriology, a path to salvation not through faith or grace, but through knowledge. The Oedipus myth, which Freud placed at the center of his system, is itself an ancient story about knowledge and self-knowledge. Oedipus is cursed because of crimes he commits unknowingly. He kills his father and marries his mother without recognizing them. His tragedy is not just that these terrible things happen, but that he doesn't know what he's doing, and then, when he does come to know, the knowledge destroys him. He blinds himself in horror at what he has seen. Freud's use of this myth is rich with meaning. On one level, it's a story about childhood desires, the boy's love for his mother, and rivalry with his father. But on another level, it's a story about the risks of self-knowledge, about the way truth can be unbearable, about how we are often better off not knowing the depths of our own nature. And yet, the myth also suggests that there is something heroic about the quest for truth, even painful truth. Oedipus could have remained in ignorance, but he pushes relentlessly to uncover the mystery of his own identity, even when everyone warns him to stop. His pursuit of truth, though it leads to suffering, is also what makes him a hero. This tension between the value of self-knowledge and the safety of ignorance runs through all of psychoanalysis. Analysis promises to make the unconscious conscious, to expand awareness, to free us from the tyranny of unknown forces. But the journey is painful. Patients in analysis often feel worse before they feel better, as the work stirs up old pain, brings to the surface conflicts that had been buried. Is it worth it? Is it better to know or not to know? Freud's answer was that knowledge is always better, that living in illusion ultimately causes more suffering than facing reality. But he also acknowledged that there are limits, that not everyone can bear the full weight of self-knowledge, that some defenses are necessary for psychic survival. The goal of analysis was not to strip away all defenses, but to make them more flexible, to replace pathological defenses with healthier ones, to expand the realm of choice and consciousness without demanding total transparency. In this, psychoanalysis acknowledges a paradox that is central to human existence. We are both known and unknown to ourselves, both subjects and objects, both the one who experiences and the one who reflects on experience. We are split beings, and this split is the source of both our suffering and our creativity. The capacity for self-reflection, for stepping back from our immediate experience and thinking about it, is what makes us human, what allows for ardent science and moral reasoning. But it also makes us anxious, makes us aware of our finitude, makes us capable of lying to ourselves and others. Freud's structural model of the mind-id, ego, superego, is a picture of this internal division, of the way we are not one thing but many, of the way different parts of us want different things and come into conflict. The id wants pleasure now. The superego wants us to be good, to meet impossible ideals. The ego tries to navigate between them, to find a workable compromise with reality. This is a tragic vision, a vision of the self as a battlefield, but it's also a vision that honors complexity, that doesn't reduce human beings to simple machines or rational calculators. The notion of the superego is particularly interesting when we think about morality and conscience. Where does our sense of right and wrong come from? Traditional answers pointed to God, to divine commandments, to natural law. Freud's answer was more psychological. Conscience is internalized authority, the voice of the parent and culture taken inside and made part of the self. The superego is harsh because children are harsh, because they internalize not just the actual parents, but an exaggerated, archaic version of parental authority, colored by their own fears and fantasies. This means that morality, for Freud, is not something we discover through reason or revelation, but something we construct through identification and internalization. It's a developmental achievement, and it's also a source of neurotic suffering when the superego becomes too tyrannical. The very force that makes civilized life possible, the internal prohibition against aggression and unbridled desire, is also the force that torments us with guilt and self-hatred. This raises profound questions about the possibility of ethical life. If morality is just internalized repression, just the parent's voice saying no, then on what basis can we make ethical judgments? Is psychoanalysis relativist? suggesting that all moral systems are equally arbitrary? Or is there a way to distinguish between healthy and unhealthy forms of conscience? Freud himself didn't fully resolve these questions, but later psychoanalytic thinkers have explored them. Some have argued for a distinction between the archaic, punitive superego of early childhood and a more mature capacity for ethical reflection that can critically examine inherited values. Some have suggested that the goal of analysis is not to abolish the superego, but to transform it, to make it less harsh and more reality-based, to replace blind obedience with thoughtful choice. The relationship between psychoanalysis and feminism has been fraught and productive. Freud's theories about women, particularly his ideas about penis envy and female development, have been extensively criticized as patriarchal and biologically reductionist. But psychoanalysis has also provided tools for feminist analysis, for understanding how gender is constructed, how women are socialized into subordinate roles, how sexism operates at the level of unconscious fantasy and desire. Feminist psychoanalysts like Karen, Horney, Clara Thompson, and later Jessica Benjamin and Nancy Chodorow have reworked Freudian theory, arguing that gender development is shaped more by social and relational factors than by biological drives. They've pointed out that women's psychology cannot be understood simply as a variant or deviation from male psychology, that women's experiences of embodiment, of mothering, of navigating a patriarchal world create psychological structures and concerns that Freud's theory didn't adequately address. The question of sexual difference runs deep in psychoanalysis. Freud saw sexual difference as fundamental, as the bedrock of identity and desire. The recognition that there are two sexes, that one has a penis and the other doesn't, was, in his view, the crucial discovery of childhood, the event that set in motion the Oedipus complex and all subsequent development. But what happens when we recognize that sexual and gender identity are more complex than a simple binary, that bodies come in more than two forms, that gender can be fluid and constructed? Contemporary psychoanalysts have engaged with queer theory, with transgender experiences, with the ways that normative assumptions about sex and gender limit our understanding of human diversity. These conversations challenge and enrich psychoanalysis, pushing it to expand beyond the heteronormative framework that Freud took for granted. The relationship between psychoanalysis and neuroscience is another ongoing conversation. Freud began his career as a neurologist, and he always believed that ultimately, psychological phenomena would be explained in terms of brain processes. He wrote a manuscript in 1895, later published as Project for a Scientific Psychology, in which he tried to sketch out a neurological model of mental functioning, describing how neurons and their patterns of excitation and inhibition could account for memory, consciousness, and symptom formation. He abandoned that project, deciding that the neuroscience of his time wasn't advanced enough to support such a theory, and he proceeded to develop psychoanalysis in purely psychological terms, using metaphors of energy and structure without tying them to specific brain mechanisms. But he always thought of this as a temporary expedient, that someday neuroscience would catch up and provide the biological foundation for psychoanalytic insights. That day may be arriving. Contemporary neuroscience has confirmed some of Freud's intuitions, that much of mental processing is unconscious, that emotional systems in the brain operate independently of conscious reasoning, that early experiences shape the developing brain in lasting ways. Technologies like fMRI allow us to see the brain in action, to identify neural circuits involved in emotion regulation, in memory consolidation, in the formation of the sense of self. Neuropsychoanalysis is an emerging field that tries to integrate psychoanalytic theory with neuroscience to find the neural correlates of concepts like repression, defense, and the unconscious. This work is exciting but also challenging because the languages of psychoanalysis and neuroscience are so different. Psychoanalysis talks about meaning, about subjective experience, about narrative and relationship. Neuroscience talks about neurons, synapses, neurotransmitters, circuits. How do we translate between these levels of description? Can we? Some argue that psychoanalysis should remain a purely psychological discipline, that attempts to reduce it to neuroscience miss the point, that the value of psychoanalysis lies precisely in its attention to meaning and subjectivity, which can't be captured by brain scans. Others argue that psychoanalysis needs a biological foundation to be credible, that it must show how its concepts map onto brain functioning or risk being dismissed as unscientific. This debate mirrors a larger question in philosophy of mind, the relationship between mind and brain, between experience and biology. Are mental states identical to brain states, such that every thought and feeling is nothing but a pattern of neural firing? Or is mind something more than brain, something that emerges from, but can't be fully explained by neurobiology? Freud, in his dualism of psyche and soma, in his theory of drives that lie on the border between the mental and the physical, was grappling with this question. He never fully resolved it, and perhaps it can't be fully resolved, because we are caught in the paradox of being both subjects and objects, both experiencers and physical organisms. The therapeutic relationship in psychoanalysis, with its emphasis on transference and the unconscious communication between two people, anticipates some of what we now know about implicit relational knowing, about the way connection happens below the level of explicit awareness. Studies of infant development show that babies and caregivers coordinate their interactions through subtle, moment-to-moment adjustments, through rhythms of gaze and touch, and vocal tone that create a sense of being attuned, of being seen and understood. These early relational patterns shape the developing brain, create templates for how the child will later relate to others, how they will regulate emotion, how they will experience themselves. When an adult enters therapy, these patterns are reactivated in the relationship with the therapist. The therapist becomes, in transference, a stand-in for early caregivers, and the quality of the therapeutic relationship, the therapist's responsiveness, reliability, and ability to survive the patient's aggression and need, provides a new experience that can revise the old templates. This relational understanding of psychoanalysis has moved the field beyond Freud's more drive-focused one-person psychology toward a two-person psychology in which both patient and analyst are seen as actively shaping the therapeutic process. The analyst is not a blank screen but a real person, and the relationship is not just a reenactment of the past but also something new, a genuine encounter that can be mutually transforming. What does all of this tell us about the human condition? What wisdom, if any, can we draw from Freud's long exploration of the psyche? Perhaps this, that we are more complex than we know, that the forces shaping us are partly hidden from view, that the past is always present, that desire and fear and guilt and longing move through us in ways we don't fully control, That consciousness is not the master of the house, but something more like a rider on an elephant, guiding when it can, but often just along for the ride. That knowledge of self is possible but difficult, requiring sustained attention, honesty, and a willingness to face painful truths. That the journey inward is as challenging as any outward journey, requiring courage and persistence. That we are relational beings, formed in connection with others, carrying inside us the voices and images of those who raised us, replicating old patterns even as we try to change. That love is complicated, always mixed with ambivalence, that the people we love we also in some part hate, and that this duality is not pathological but fundamental to the human heart. That civilization is a fragile achievement, built on the renunciation of instinct, requiring constant effort to maintain. That the thin crust of culture can crack under pressure, releasing the primitive forces beneath. That we are capable of great cruelty and great kindness, and often the line between them is thinner than we'd like to believe. That meaning is constructed, not given, that we are storytelling creatures who make sense of our lives by weaving narratives, and that these narratives shape what we can experience and become. That therapy, at its best, is a reauthoring, a chance to tell a different story about who we are and what our suffering means. That there is something valuable in the examined life, in the willingness to question ourselves, to look at our own complicity in our suffering, to take responsibility for our inner world, even as we acknowledge how much is beyond our control. And perhaps most importantly, that suffering is meaningful. That symptoms speak. That pain is not just something to be eliminated, but something to be understood. That the psyche is always trying to tell us something if we can learn to listen. Freud was a man of his time and place, a Victorian Jew in Imperial Vienna, shaped by the prejudices and assumptions of his era. He was wrong about many things. His theories about women were distorted by patriarchal bias. His emphasis on sexuality was too narrow. His therapeutic technique could be authoritarian. His scientific claims were often overstated. But he was also a pioneer, a figure who opened up new territories of thought, who asked questions that no one had quite asked before, who took seriously the reality of the inner life at a time when psychology was just beginning to separate itself from philosophy and physiology. He gave us a vocabulary, a way of thinking about ourselves that has become second nature. When we say someone is in denial, when we talk about Freudian slips, when we refer to someone as anal or narcissistic, when we wonder about the unconscious meaning of a dream, we are using tools that Freud forged or refined. He modeled a particular form of attention, patient, sustained, curious, willing to see beneath the surface. He showed that every detail matters, that the trivial and the seemingly meaningless can be doorways to deeper understanding. He approached the human psyche as an archaeologist approaches a tell, carefully brushing away layers, reconstructing vanished worlds from fragments. And he embodied a kind of intellectual courage, a willingness to follow ideas wherever they led, even when they led to uncomfortable places, even when they challenged conventional morality and cherished beliefs. He was not afraid of the dark, not afraid to acknowledge the aggression and perversity and irrationality that lie within us all. In the end, perhaps what we take from Freud is not any particular theory, but a stance, an attitude toward the mystery of consciousness and the challenge of self-knowledge. The attitude says, look deeper. There's more here than meets the eye. The obvious explanation is probably not the whole story. What appears irrational may have its own logic. What we reject in others may be what we can't face in ourselves. This hermeneutic of suspicion, as the philosopher Paul Ricoeur called it, is Freud's lasting gift. Along with Marx and Nietzsche, Freud taught us to question surface appearances, to see how interests and forces we're unaware of shape what presents itself as natural or inevitable. This suspicious reading can be taken too far, can become paranoid or reductionistic, but it's also a necessary corrective to naivety, a tool for understanding how power and desire operate in hidden ways. At the same time, psychoanalysis at its best is not just suspicious, but also compassionate, not just unmasking, but also understanding. The analyst's task is to make sense of what seems senseless, to find the human logic in symptoms and dreams, to show that even the most bizarre behavior is a response to something, an attempt to solve a problem, a creative adaptation to impossible circumstances. This double movement of suspicion and empathy, of critical questioning and deep listening, is what makes psychoanalysis more than just a technique or a theory. It's a way of being with another person's suffering, a willingness to accompany them into difficult territory, to bear witness to what they've survived. We might think of Freud as a cartographer of inner space, mapping territories that had been terra incognita, giving names to regions of experience that had been uncharted. The map he drew was incomplete, sometimes inaccurate, and it has been revised extensively by later travelers. But it was a beginning, a first systematic attempt to chart the geography of the unconscious. And the journey continues. Psychoanalysis has evolved and diversified, spawning multiple schools and approaches, engaging with new questions and challenges. It has spread beyond its European origins, taking root in different cultures, being transformed and transformed by them. It has engaged with feminism, queer theory, critical race theory, trauma studies, neuroscience, and many other fields, each conversation enriching and complicating its original vision. The question of whether psychoanalysis is science or art, psychology or hermeneutics, therapy or philosophy, remains open and perhaps unanswerable. Maybe it's all of these things, a hybrid discipline that lives on the borders between different ways of knowing, drawing on empirical observation and imaginative interpretation, on clinical evidence and theoretical speculation. What seems clear is that the questions Freud asked about the nature of consciousness, the origins of suffering, the possibility of change, the relationship between past and present, the forces that move us without our knowledge, are enduring questions, questions that each generation must ask anew. In a sense, Freud's life and work are a mirror in which we can see ourselves, our own questions about who we are and why we suffer, and how we might live more freely. The specifics of his theories may fade, may be superseded by newer research and different paradigms, but the fundamental insight that we are mysteries to ourselves, that self-knowledge is both possible and necessary, that the journey inward is worth undertaking, that insight remains vital. As we drift now toward the end of this long night's contemplation, let us return to where we began, to Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, to a man sitting in his consulting room surrounded by ancient figurines, listening to a patient on the couch, trying to make sense of the tangled threads of a human life. There is something almost sacred in that image, in the simple act of one person listening deeply to another, attending to the nuances of speech and silence, holding space for pain and confusion, believing that meaning can be found, that understanding is possible, that the talking cure might work. This is what Freud bequeathed to us. Not a finished system, not a set of dogmas to be accepted or rejected, but a method, a practice, an orientation toward the hidden dimensions of experience. He taught us to take our dreams seriously, to listen to what our symptoms are saying, to pay attention to the slips and accidents that reveal what we're trying to hide. He taught us that childhood matters, that the early years shape us in lasting ways, that to understand who we are now, we need to understand who we were then and what happened to us, and how we made sense of it in our child's mind. He taught us about ambivalence, that we can love and hate the same person, that every positive feeling has a shadow side, that accepting our complexity is part of becoming whole. He taught us about defense, that we have many ways of protecting ourselves from painful truths, and that these defenses, though they cause suffering, were once necessary, were the best solutions we could find to impossible dilemmas. He taught us about the power of relationship, that we repeat old patterns in new relationships, that the past is not past but alive and active in how we engage with others now, and that recognizing these patterns gives us a chance to choose differently. He taught us humility, that we are not as rational or conscious or in control as we like to think, that there are forces within us that we don't understand, that self-knowledge is always partial, always provisional, always a work in progress. And he taught us hope, not the shallow hope that everything will be okay, but the deeper hope that comes from facing reality, the hope that understanding brings a measure of freedom, the hope that awareness itself is healing even when it doesn't eliminate pain. As you lie here now, in the dark, drifting towards sleep, perhaps you can sense some of these truths stirring in your own depths. Perhaps you can feel the presence of the unconscious, that vast interior ocean on which consciousness floats like a small boat. Perhaps you can recognize the voices of the past echoing in your present feelings. Perhaps you can glimpse the complexity of your own desires, the tangle of love and fear and longing that moves through you. This is the territory that Freud opened up, the landscape he invited us to explore. The journey is yours to make, in your own way, in your own time. But know that you are not alone in it, that countless others have traveled this inward path before you, that guides and companions are available if you seek them. Rest now in the mystery of your own being, in the knowledge that you contain multitudes, that depths lie beneath depths, that you are more than you seem and less than you imagine, that you are, like all of us, a work in progress, a story still being written, a dream still unfolding. Let Freud's voice join the chorus of those who have tried to understand the human soul, who have ventured into the darkness and returned with maps and stories, who have insisted that the examined life, for all its difficulty, is worth living. Sleep now, and in your sleeping, dream. And in your dreaming, know that even there, in the strange theater of the night, meaning is being made, symbols are speaking, the unconscious is doing its work, and in the morning, if you care to look, you may find messages waiting, riddles to unravel, clues to the mystery of who you are. Rest in the knowledge that you are held by something larger than yourself, whether you call it the unconscious, the psyche, the soul, or simply the vast web of connection that links all minds, all lives, all stories. You are part of the human family, inheritor of all its struggles and wisdom, carrier of its questions forward into the future. May your dreams be deep and your rest be sweet. May you wake with a little more understanding, a little more compassion for yourself and others. May you find in the talking and the listening, in the remembering and the working through, some measure of the freedom and wholeness that Freud believed was possible, even in a world of conflict and renunciation. Good night, traveler. Thank you for walking this long path with me through Freud's life and thought, through the corridors of the unconscious and the chambers of the human heart. May the insights of psychoanalysis, whatever their limitations, serve as lanterns in your own dark passages, as companions in your solitude, as reminders that the journey inward is as vast and worthy as any journey outward into the world. Sleep now, and let the old doctor rest too, his work done, his questions passed on to us, his faith in the power of understanding. For all its complications, a gift that we can accept or refuse as we choose, but a gift nonetheless, offered in the hope that we might know ourselves a little better, suffer a little less, and find our way, however haltingly, toward lives of greater truth and freedom. The lamp grows dim, the voice fades, the couch is empty, but the conversation continues. In every therapy room, in every dream interpreted, in every moment when we pause to ask, what am I really feeling? What do I really want? What am I afraid to know? This is Freud's legacy, this endless conversation with ourselves, this commitment to the examined life, this belief that the unconscious can be made conscious, that shadows can be brought to light, that talking, somehow, impossibly, can cure. Rest now in that strange faith, that improbable hope. Let the night do its work. Let the dreams come. And in the morning, when you wake, perhaps you'll remember something, some fragment of the night's journey, some whisper from the depths, and you'll wonder what it means. And in wondering, you'll be continuing the work that Freud began, the endless, necessary human work of trying to understand who we are. Sleep well, dear listener. The talking cure is also the listening cure, the dreaming cure, the paying attention cure. It happens in the consulting room and in the bedroom, in the waking hours and the sleeping ones, wherever we turn our gaze inward and ask the questions that matter. Freud would tell you that the journey never ends, that analysis is interminable, that we will never fully know ourselves. But he would also tell you that the journey is worth taking, that every step toward awareness is a victory, small perhaps, but real. So take that step now, into sleep, into dreams, into the depths where Freud believed the truth of who we are can be found. If we dare to look, if we're willing to see, if we have the courage to remember and age, the patience to understand. Good night, sweet dreams, and may the morning bring you, if not answers, then at least better questions and the strength to keep asking them.